If you want to take better seascape photos, then stick around and learn from a master of beautiful seascapes. Hello and welcome to episode number 103 of the Photographing the West podcast. If you're new here, I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan, and I'm a nature and wildlife photographer. If you're not new, welcome back. It's a great pleasure to welcome back fine art landscape photographer Alan Majchrowicz. Today we're going to take a deep dive into photographing seascapes. Welcome back, Alan.
Well, thank you for having me back again, Kirby. I appreciate the opportunity to to speak with you and maybe give some good tips to your listeners and viewers.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. So what attracts you to the sea in particular for your photography?
Boy, I don't know. That's seascape is, people just love the sea, and my wife and I love to get out to the coast as much as possible, but generally only a couple times a year. I've always kind of have a draw to the coastal areas, and seascape photography really offers, a different opportunity for photography that, there's different elements present there that just aren't present, around in regular landscape and nature photography. It's a lot of fun being on the coast.
Yeah, it is. I agree. You seem to be able to find amazing textures to incorporate into your photos. So do you scout the locations ahead of time, or how does that happen?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's plenty of locations from anywhere from, California to Washington. And they all have different characteristics. The Oregon coast is definitely different from the Washington coast, and different from the California coast. And, there's so much variety from, sandy beaches and areas with sea stacks and interesting rock formations and wave patterns and different surf patterns throughout the year, especially in winter. So there's all kinds of different things to work with.
Most of your photos seem to be taken at low tide with no wind and at or near sunset. So.
Yeah.
Well, that's the prime time, of course. So
right.
What tools do you use to be in the right place at the right time?
Well, just generally, aside from the usual tools of, going online and, doing some, research on other, Google images and looking at maps and state parks, just trying to find out, some of the good places to go. The most important tool, I think any seascape photographer has is to find a good website or periodical that offers tide tables. And I think I generally go to the NOAA website, because obviously if you're looking for images that are only available at low tide, you'll have to make sure that you're there at the right time. And it can be kind of difficult. Some areas are very difficult to time for that, because in the summer, the lowest tides are in like around May and June and July, and happen generally around towards the evening. In the winter, it's kind of the opposite. The tides aren't as low, but they could happen, after, late in the evening or even in the middle of the night. So you kind of have to do a lot of research on if you're looking for a specific location, when the best tide opportunities are. There's one location I remember I wanted to go to on the California coast. I'm not really sure where it was, but it's called Bowling Ball Beach.
Oh yeah.
And I think, if you've seen it, a lot of your viewers are kind of familiar with that. The one time I was in the area, I really wanted to try and get some photographs of it, but it's only available, to certain low tides, certain times of the year. And when I was there, I just wasn't able to, to be there at the right time. So places like that, if you want to get photos, you have to kind of, do some research in advance and find out when the best opportunities were to avoid, disappointment and frustration.
Yeah, and to be safe too. I mean, you can get safe trapped.
Too, yeah. Yeah, that's another aspect. You really have to, be careful of knowing when tides are coming in and going out, because on the Washington coast in Olympic National Park, there are some beaches that are only accessible via low tide. And if you're not careful, you can be photographing, get kind of carried away and not notice that the tide's coming in, and it cuts you off from a headland, and you could be trapped. So safety is a major consideration when you're talking about low and high tides.
So do you go back to the same locations over and over, or are you always looking for new ones? Or
I'm always looking for new ones.
Yeah.
Always, on the lookout for new locations. Over the years, I've checked out pretty much all the good spots from north of Los Angeles up to the very tip of the Olympic Peninsula. Obviously, you can't be in all the same places at the same time. So there's places on the Oregon coast that I really like to photograph, and if I get down there one year on a trip and the conditions aren't that good, the tides aren't good or the light's good, I always make a mental note, try and come back the next year or several years later. So I try to mix it up. One year I'd like to go into Olympic National Park. Other years I kind of try and focus on the Oregon coast or the California coast.
Okay.
Because they all offer different subject matter, completely different from each other. So.
Yeah, for sure. So how much time do you spend in a given location trying to get the ideal shot?
Well, it depends on the time I have available and weather forecasts. For example, if I go to any location, say like in Olympic National Park, and I have several days available, and the conditions look favorable in one place, I'll stick out for several days, and if it doesn't look like it's going to really work out, and in the long-term forecast, and I'm kind of running out of time, I just do the best I can with what the conditions I have, and come back at another time. I generally in the past, it's been 3 or 4 days at the most.
Okay. So you're not doing shots and then moving on to the next site an hour later or whatever, huh?
Well, again, it depends on the location. Some of the photographs I sent you, one of the examples is Shore Acres State Park on the Oregon coast. It's a wonderful state park, which is fantastic rock formations, and there's several really interesting areas there, maybe about 1.5 miles apart. So last year when I went down there, I spent, I think, about 3 or 4 days, and I tried to choose the best locations for the time of day. I stayed in one location generally for the whole evening or morning or whatever, and then the next day I'll try and move on to the other location. Or if the first day I didn't get the best stuff, I'll try and stick there again. So you kind of have to go with the flow of the weather patterns. But yes, it's kind of fruitless, if you have 3 or 4 days available and you've got like 5 different locations you really want to photograph, but they're like 20 or 30 miles apart. You're kind of running back and forth and just not having enough time available to do a good job.
Right. Yeah. So most of your seascapes appear to have been shot with a wide angle lens. Is there a specific lens or focal length that you prefer?
Seascape photography in that respect can be a little different than general landscape photography. Most of my work, I think, is done, I would say, from a normal lens, like 50 to 70 millimeters, to ultra wide 14. Again, it just depends on the location. If you're working on a beach with lots of interesting patterns from tide pools, generally going for the wide angle to ultra wide angle to incorporate those patterns in your composition. If you're photographing from some bluff areas, looking down, you're probably going to go more towards a normal to very short telephoto lens. So again, it's just like everything else, it depends on where you're photographing and what's the best tools to use for it.
Sure. So how do you go about composing your seascapes? Like I said in the beginning, you like to use a lot of texture either in the ocean itself or in the rocks and that sort of thing. So,
well, let's go to the example of beaches, sandy beach type thing. again, it really helps, you got to know the tide conditions, and it really helps if you've been there previously and, seen what's available when the tide is out. Is it, when the tide goes out, is it just sand available with some rocks, or is it an area with some really interesting tide pools that only get revealed, at certain times, really low tides or whatever. And so if you have that information in advance when you return, you could pretty much predict, which areas would be the best to concentrate on. And when you're there and the conditions are right, I do a lot of scouting around the area, very careful scouting, to find, the best kind of patterns that could offer, like leading lines or interesting abstract, patterns or lines and that type of thing. And one of the things you have to be really careful with, especially on sandy beaches, is the same conditions if you're doing winter photography in the snow. You kind of have to walk gingerly around the very outskirts of the area you want to photograph, because you definitely don't want to be tracking footprints all over the sand. And, sometimes you could retouch that out and, post-processing, but sometimes you can't. So generally when I go out and, in a spot like that, I'll walk around, several times, keep low to the ground and see what kind of patterns are available. And of course, keeping the eye on the waves too.
What gear do you use for your seascapes, and how do you protect it from saltwater?
Oh, that's one of the biggest issues of seascape photography. My gear kit is pretty much the same as what I take for any other type of photography. My body is Nikon D850. I have a 14 to 24 millimeter lens, a 70 to 100, and then a 24 to 70 and a 70 to 200 millimeter zoom lenses. Plus I take a bunch of graduated neutral density filters, and there's the usual polarizer type stuff, and remote releases, and a good tripod. What was the other part of the question?
How do you protect the gear?
Oh, how do I protect?
Saltwater?
Yeah. It's kind of tricky. So there's not a whole lot you could do, aside from, protecting, your gear with maybe some Ziploc bags around your cameras or lenses. Generally, if it's not too windy, you don't have to worry too much about sea spray. I mean, I always carry extra lens fluid and microfiber wipes to keep everything clean. Certain instances, if you're shooting at, I could tell you a couple when I was down in California several years ago. It was everywhere I went, every day it was really windy, and it was nearly impossible to keep sea spray off your camera. I mean, I would put a shirt or a jacket or something over the camera to keep it free from sea spray until I'm ready to actually shoot. And those few seconds when I took it off, I mean, it was still covered with sea spray. So you really have to be careful, to keep it off your lens, and absolutely make sure that when you're done, to always wipe off your gear, because that if you don't keep it clean, eventually it's going to work its way inside the lenses and bodies, and then you're in big trouble.
Then they're a paperweight, basically. Let's take a look at some of your photos before we go any further. Where is that? Do you remember?
That is Shore Acres State Park in just south of the Central Coast, around Coos Bay, I believe, between Coos Bay and Bandon, Oregon.
Oh, okay.
This particular park is extremely popular in the winter during storms. And some of those big rocks on the left, when the waves hit them, just enormous amounts of wave sprays vertically in the air. If you do a Google search on Shore Acres State Park, there's one particular rock that's always photographed in winter, because it's just really dramatic waves crashing up and down there. Like I mentioned before, at Shore Acres, there's several different areas that are really interesting for photography. This is one of them, looking out onto the ocean and working with the different wave action. As you can see, on this one, I waited for some of the waves to flow over the rocks, and you've got those little cascade rivulets of water going down the sides of the rocks. They add a little bit of interest to it. In the distance, the bluffs in the distance, you could walk around on those and pick out some really careful compositions with great rock formations. There's what do they call mineral concretions, would make these like bowling ball size things coming out of the rocks. Great to work with. And this one is actually right against the fence on a viewpoint. So this is a super easy place to go and just sit there and wait for the light.
So this looks very sharp from foreground to background. Did you do any focus stacking or anything special on this?
No, not on this. I generally only use focus stacking techniques when I'm doing a super wide angle lens and there's subject matter that's close to the foreground that would be impossible to keep it sharp from foreground to background with generally stopping down. In those cases, I might work on focus stacking, and again, it just depends on the circumstances. But on this, it's pretty easy to get a good sharp clean image, by stopping down f11 to 22, somewhere around there.
Okay. Do people still worry about diffraction at f22 like they used to, or the lens is good enough it doesn't matter?
I think it matters to an extent. The quality of the lens that you have, some of the higher end expensive lenses, it's minimalized. There's not that much of a problem, but I generally still, regardless, I try and avoid stopping all the way down to 22 or so. The lenses I have are very good quality, so most of the time I can get away with 16 or so and get everything really sharp. Back in the days when I was shooting large format, I was focusing and shooting at f64. It's like really way down. Then you got some really super long exposures when you go down that low. But modern DSL lenses, I don't think they may even go much lower than 22.
Yeah, none of the ones I have do anyway. I think I have the same.
I do have the macro Nikkor one, 105 millimeter. I think that goes down to 32.
Yeah.
But that's a specialty lens. So.
This the same location, or?
Yes, and that's one of the things I kind of wanted to point out when you're at specific locations, especially like this one. The Seascapes subject matter it's such a dynamic location. I mean, things are changing constantly. As you can see in this one, it's a similar shot. It's maybe about an hour or two earlier. The light is just getting around golden hour. The tide is a little higher up, so you see more interesting wave action crashing on the rocks. So it's one thing I like to point out is don't just go plan on spending one time during the day at a location. You can go, I'm just going to shoot at blue hour and just get there and shoot at blue hour. But if you go earlier, I mean, you can get different perspectives on things. Like I said, it's always changing. So a shot that's really good at this time of day, what you see in front of you, may be pretty bad during blue hour or other times. So I like to try and cover my bases, and one that likes to see opportunities to photograph specific areas, any time of day. I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, most photographers believe you can only get good photographs, sunrise, sunset during, golden hour, but different subject matter looks really good in different times of day too. I mean, overcast gives you opportunities that you can't get in sunny days. So yeah, always stick around and check out how things change throughout the day. Maybe you're surprised.
Yeah, and I think the dynamic range of the newer cameras, at least, has gotten much better. So it's easier to shoot during the middle of the day too.
Absolutely, yeah. And along with that, software, Photoshop has come a long way over the years.
Yeah, for sure.
And again, there's there's the third of the from Shore Acres. That's similar composition. That little building there on the left, that's where from that overlook there, that's where the previous two images were photographed. And you can see this is just after sunset. So I was able to go with just a slightly longer exposure where the water isn't completely blurred, but you get areas where it's a little bit sharp and a little bit blurry. So it kind of gives a mix of textures on there, as opposed to getting just one really long exposure and the water just completely smooth. In this instance, I thought it kind of looked interesting with those mixed textures.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that, at least to me, that smooth, silky water thing seems to be overdone these days. But
well, again, as it depends on your subject matter. Most photographers at the beginning is they go for the really long exposures and get absolutely no texture in it. You just get that silky smooth. And in certain times, that does look great, but right. It's not the be all and end all. You practice around like this one on this shot. I don't know how many I did differently. I started with a range where it was a very fast exposure where the all the detail in the water was captured, really well because it was a short exposure. This one's kind of a medium one. I also did really long exposures where the water is more silky. And, it's a good idea, if you're not really sure, just go ahead and take a whole variety of them, because when you get back into your office and start processing, you can pick and choose. And in this instance, I think this kind of exposure worked out the best for me. So, you're not spending any extra money like you did on film to make more exposure. So go ahead and,
right.
And play around with it.
Yeah, I think that works well in this case because there's really a lot going on in the water, which makes it more interesting. One of my favorites.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites too. And this is again Shore Acres State Park, and the previous image you saw. This is pretty much right behind me. There's a big sandstone shelf with different tiers that goes down to the water, and this upper tier has some great formations that are kind of easy to access without danger of falling off the cliffs and such. And this kind of harks back to my fascination and love of the original Alien series. There's so many places I've been to, like in Bisty Badlands and in New Mexico and Shore Acres, or for some reason I see these alien images pop into my head, these out of the abstract rock formation. So I have fun working with that kind of stuff. And this one, it works really nicely with the sunset.
Yeah,
I should add that this one's a little bit more heavily processed than I generally do. I didn't get that kind of focus and drama with a standard processing where it's just a little bit more lighter and even all over. So,
any specialized software you use other than
nope.
Lightroom and Photoshop?
I just use Photoshop. Okay. I do not use Lightroom except in a very specific instance of uploading to my Photo Shelter account. I played around with Lightroom, but I'm one of the very few photographers that it just doesn't work for me. Most of the processing I do in Photoshop doesn't really work as well in Lightroom because I'm working with different layers, not really elaborate layers, but it's just some basic layers that I don't have the control. I wouldn't have the control available if I just worked exclusively in Lightroom. So yeah, this is all done just Photoshop.
Okay. Yeah, that rock in the foreground looks like a dragon's head to me.
Yeah.
Beautiful light there.
Thank you. Now this one, probably a lot of your viewers are probably very familiar with this. This is Second Beach in Olympic National Park. It's probably one of the classic locations along the Washington coast. And I think I've never seen the series, but I believe this area was featured in the Twilight series years ago, Second Beach area. But this is one spot that's really interesting to work with. It has lots of tide pools. and different kinds of sand patterns. And another thing I should have mentioned before is one of the dynamic range of coastal photography. You can see in this one is when I photograph this, if I came back a couple months later at the same low tide, this may not be there. There may be some, the sand shift constantly throughout the year and throughout months, depending on storms. So you can go there, year after year after year, and you'll never get the same image because things are shifting. The sand shifts all the time. Tide pools appear that were never there before, and some that you've seen classically, in other photographs. When you get there, they may not be there anymore. One specific area on the north of this, it's called Seascape Beach and Point of the Arches in the Olympic National Park. Years ago, in the 90s, there were some photographs at low tide of all these rocks that were lined up parallel to each other on the beach. And on the underside of them were just filled with just beautifully colored sea stars. With a wide angle lens, you got this great diminishing perspective effect from those parallel rocks coming out of the sand at low tide. But now I've been there numerous times over the past 15 years, and storm patterns have pretty much buried the whole thing, where only the very tips of those are available, to see during low tide. But again, that's when I go there, it was generally in spring. So if you go in fall, that might be a different occasion where some storms washed away all that sand, and that those patterns are now available. So definitely things are always changing.
Keeps things interesting, I guess.
Yeah, and this is another example too, where I was mentioning before. All this sandy beach. When you're scouting out locations, it's best to start at the outside and work your way slowly in, so you don't end up walking back and forth all over the beach and tracking tons and tons of footsteps all over the sand. This particular beach, Second Beach, is kind of difficult to avoid that because it's one of the most popular beaches on the Olympic National Park coast. During the summer season, there'll be hundreds of people on this beach. This photograph in this instance was taken, I believe, like on a Tuesday or Wednesday, I think it was in April, and there were only two other photographers there. So it was a very rare instance where you had this whole beach to yourself and you didn't really have to worry about the sand being all tracked out.
Yeah, there's all kinds of texture in the sand. The more you look, the more you find.
Yeah, I have to go back again many times because, like I said, this one changes so much over the years. You'll always be surprised when you get down there. That's okay. This is a similar one. This is just after sunset, kind of getting into the blue hour. And again, scouting around this area just reveals all these wonderful textures and patterns that you could play around with and incorporate into compositions. And one thing should be noticed about this beach too is that little keyhole in the rock. That's pretty much if you're looking to get a photograph of the sun coming through there, you're better off. You have better chances on, I think, in the late spring, summer months. I'm not really sure. I'd have to go back and look at the angles again. But yeah, that's another thing to be aware of. Some areas on some beaches may not be in their look best during certain times of the year, just because how the sun moves from north to south throughout the year. So if you're looking for a dramatic image of the sun hitting through that little keyhole in the cliff there, it's really pretty good to check that out in advance. What time of year that may be possible. I think there's one rock that I cannot remember. It's on the California coast where there's only like several weeks out of the year during low tide where the sun actually pokes through this specific little sea cave in the rock and illuminates the foreground. So always check those things out.
So this is still Second Beach, I'm thinking.
Yes.
Okay. And looks like the tide is way out on that particular day. Huh?
Yeah, this is not actually the lowest tide. This is kind of a medium. I think maybe it was 0.1, something like that. And I was mentioning earlier, in the late spring, summer months, you can get -3 tides, which will reveal even more sandy beach and some really interesting tide pools, filled with anemones and sea stars that might not be available to photograph on an average low tide. So yeah, some of the photographs I've seen in the past, I thought they were really wonderful. This specific beach, they weren't available on this specific instance because the tide wasn't low enough.
Okay. Let's move along here, I guess.
And again, there's the same beach,
right,
a little bit later into blue hour, and you can see how to play around with some of the patterns and shapes, and get different kinds of compositions.
A nice leading line there, and
yeah,
nice reflection. So I've never seen that particular pattern on the coast. Is that, I assume that's the tide going out? Is that?
Well, that's actually the edge of a larger shallow tide pool.
Oh, okay.
And this is where your super ultra wide angle comes in handy, because if you can get really low to the sand, which I did here, I was pretty much kneeling with my tripod. The camera was as low as I can with the tripod. You could accentuate that line where it dominates a little bit in the foreground and kind of fades away to bring your attention onto the sea stacks in the back and in the sun.
Yeah.
This is again Olympic National Park, but this is a different beach further north. This is also in the La Push area, not too far from the last one, but this is actually Rialto Beach. Yeah, and that's Split Rock in the distance. Now this beach, is completely different than Second Beach in the fact that you can see the sand and gravel in the foreground. The beach is a lot steeper, and it's not really sandy. There's kind of like little pebbles and stuff. So you're not going. This beach doesn't have the kind of tide pools available as the other one does. So you're working with a kind of a different environment here. But this one does have some really nice rocks that you can see where you can see the water flowing around. It should be mentioned that there is one rock. It's not in this composition. That's been a very popular attraction for photographers over the years, but I don't know when it happened, but several years ago, it did collapse. So it was kind of similar to the one that you see in the distance, but it was a lot smaller. And it was very popular for compositions, from what I've seen. And that one is no longer there. So again, dynamic environment.
Yeah. Do you shoot any of the tide pool wildlife ever, or you just stick to the landscape?
Occasionally, yeah. If the lighting is right, it's not really, if it's overcast and it's not contrast, and you can get a nice even light on. I photograph, anemones and sea stars and whatnot. Another thing I should point out on photographing on coastal areas, you could kind of this image illustrates it a little bit. Is I'm right on the tide, right on the edge of the water there. When you're shooting really low and the tide may be starting to come in, you have to be very careful, because you're shooting low and the water could easily come right over your cameras, and on the texture of that sand that you see there, when the water comes over it, it makes it almost like quicksand. So if you got a long exposure and you get a little bit of wave action coming around your tripod, it'll start sticking the tripod and move it. So on this particular evening, I was photographing quite a bit in this area, and I'd set up, I get one shot, and I have to move right away because the water's coming in, moving the sand around. So again, be very cautious of the waves and be aware, of the surface that you're photographing on, because some sand could act, really suck your boots down there and act like quicksand, and others can just wash away materials very easily. This again is Olympic National Park and is further south from the other ones that we were just looking at. This is Kaleilock Beach. This is one of my favorite areas to go to, mainly because my wife and I have been going there almost every year since we got married. It's kind of one of our favorite areas, to go to. It's a nice, really long, sandy beach. It's just really fun to walk around on. South of here, there's not much interest of it. It's just a flat, sandy beach. But as you go a little bit north along the beach at low tide, you'll get some interesting rock formations. Like this one, you could work around with, incorporate into compositions during different times of day. Of course, this is at sunset. Some foggy clouds, coming in right around the horizon there to break it up.
Yeah. Again, lots of gorgeous textures in there.
This is one, I threw this in because this really shows, again, the dynamic quality of photographing on the coast. This is Gold Beach in Redwoods National Park, California. That morning, I spent the night there hoping I can get some good coastal shots. I got up in the morning, it was all fogged in. And I waited around for, an hour or two, and nothing seemed to be happening. So I packed up and I started driving slowly down the coast, and the fog started breaking up. And as you can see on this part of the coast, the sand is almost like, black lava sand, although I don't think it is lava, but it's a very dark sand. And I decided I was going to, spend some time there and just play around and see wave patterns and how the receding waves make, different patterns and shapes in the sand as it recedes. And as you can see, at the same time, the clouds are moving around a bit. So I came around with many images of this. And after post-processing, I thought each one of them kind of stands on their own nicely. But turning them into a triptych with 3 separate images, kind of shows, how, the different patterns of, how things change throughout time, even within a few minutes.
Yeah, interesting. So you camp out mostly when you're doing these? Or you're
yeah, always camp. If it's an area where I have to, the backpack in, which generally is an Olympic National Park, there's a few areas like that where it's only accessible by overnight backpacking. But most of the times, you're accessible by, state park campgrounds or national park campgrounds. And I always try and find places as close as possible to, to my subject matter. Some people, they want to stay in motels, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you always have to be aware that the nearest motel that you choose to your subject matter may involve a lot of extra driving time. So
yeah,
I think it's a lot more beneficial for me, at least, to find places to spend overnight where I don't have to do a lot of driving. If I wake up and a light's starting, to get really good, I just have minutes to get to my subject matter.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's lots of state parks on Washington, Oregon, and California coast. So.
Yeah. This is another point I kind of wanted to illustrate is there's different ways to post-process images. It's not, I don't like to try and always go for the same look like in some of the earlier shots of Shore Acres State Park, where it's nice, warm, dramatic, saturated colors and a little bit darker. I like to sometimes go with, depending on the conditions and the image you're photographing, where dial down the saturation, boost up the contrast, because sometimes one thing that you always do photograph and post processing might not look good the way you normally use. So I like to play around with different looks to fit the scene.
So a lot of coastal areas, I think anyway, are prone to fog in the summertime, right?
Oh yeah, that's another thing to be aware of, especially on the Northern California coast and quite a bit of just about anywhere from California to Washington. Some areas are stocked in with fog, July and August, where it's almost impossible. You could wait for day after day after day, and you may only get a very brief break in the fog, like right at sunset or before sunset. So I generally like to go to coastal areas in spring or late spring, or in the fall, so I don't have to worry too much about contending with constant day after day after fog. So another thing to be aware of when you're doing coastal photography. Now, that's on the West Coast. If you're on the East Coast, you might have different patterns. You might not have that problem with fog.
Yeah, and if you go spring and fall, you're less likely to run into hordes of people too, I would imagine.
Right. The other thing besides fog too is wind. On the California coast, when I was there in spring, every place I went to day after day was just really, really windy, just terribly windy. So sometimes a year, there's different elements you have to deal with throughout the year. In winter, you've got driving rain, winds, high surfs and high tides. In spring, you may have a little bit more wind, but better light. In the summer, you have no wind, but fog. So there's a lot to be aware of.
Do you get any king tides on the West Coast?
Any what tides?
King tides?
King tide, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, where there's a big difference between high tide and low tide.
Oh, you mean like in the Bay of Fundy, where there's like about a 30-foot difference type thing?
Yeah, or in Alaska, there's places where the tide difference in high tide and low tide maybe 30 or 40 feet.
Oh, well, no, we don't get that on it's not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
On the really low tides, where you get maybe like a -3, -3.5, that's about as low as you get in most of the West Coast locations.
You're talking about feet, not inches, right?
Yeah, -3.5 feet low. The high tide may be, I don't know, several hours later, maybe 7 or 8 feet. It's not a huge difference, like you're mentioning in Alaska, or several years ago I was in the Bay of Fundy, and that's an area that's really noted for extreme tides too. I think it's like you were saying in Alaska, about 30-foot difference. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, anything else you want to cover before we wrap it up?
One other little thing I kind of want to mention, the photo here can illustrate it too, is coastal areas are a great place to play around with minimalist compositions too. Where, as you can see in this, this isn't as minimalist as it goes, but you only have several elements to work with, and you have the opportunity in coastal areas to play with that. Especially when you get down to really long exposures in the evening, where things are a little bit smoother and stuff. So I like to play around with minimalist opportunities when I'm on the coast. There's not as many places, except maybe in the prairies, where you could do that.
Yeah. Okay, we're back. So where can people find your work and all the stuff you do?
You can find it on my website, alanmajchrowicz.com. I'm on Pinterest, Facebook, all the usual suspects. And I do have another website called Alan Crow Photography, which is a little bit easier to pronounce and remember the spelling of, CROWE. That site has more fine art, and the other one has a mixture of fine art and stock opportunities there. So check any of those out.
All right. Well, thanks again, Alan, for sharing your approach to seascapes. It was great fun as usual.
Great, and thank you for having me again. I really appreciate it. I really hope your viewers picked up some tips that maybe they weren't aware of before.
Yeah, I think so.
Photographically and safety-wise.
Yeah. So these podcasts are published on the 15th and 30th of each month. If you enjoy them, please tell your family and friends about us. We'll be back on March 30th with another interview with an interesting photographer doing interesting things. Bye for now.